Hello everybody, welcome to Open Forum again. Tonight we're having UrielOrlow and CelineCondorelli. We've been working with, I can call it cross practices, come from different backgrounds, what I understood. And they're having a show tomorrow at the Fine Art Society here in Oslo, lasting until 22nd of this month. And the exhibition is called The Rain Vine. Right?
It's got 3 titles.
Okay, we have 3 titles. Images. Right. And yeah, hope you enjoy, and if you can talk a bit better about yourselves and maybe introduce the exhibition, a little bit about your process. Hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us. Yeah, I'll just say a couple of words while we talk. If you want, you can interrupt us with questions. It doesn't have to be like a whole block of us talking and then questions at the end. So it can be broken up with questions if you have some in the middle. And also we decided to structure our presentation or talk today with 6 turns, and we'll each talk around these turns mainly in relation to the project that we are presenting at the Kunstforening tomorrow. And we sort of show you maybe some teasers of the work, but we don't actually show you all the work, so hopefully you'll come tomorrow to see it.
So our first term is position.
What?
Position. Position is quite an important, or how to position oneself has been quite an important and recurrent issue that we discuss around, and that we find is fundamental to understanding any practice, not just what we're talking about, but also where we're speaking from. So we start with who we are and somehow where we come from. We both live in London, as you probably know this, and we've been developing a project in Egypt over the last couple of years. We have something that I would somehow call it itinerant practices, in the sense that we travel quite a lot, and our projects, or my projects, and Uriel's project, because this is actually the first time we worked together, we never collaborated before this Egyptian project. Often my projects take place not just over many places, geographical places, also in the sense that I go and follow the work, one project after another, but also it takes place over many mediums. So the form of my practice somehow can include exhibition making, or writing, or curating, or teaching, of course, is super important to me. And it can be classified in different disciplines. Also, I studied architecture, I come from architecture. So, you know, depending where you're working, your work gets called differently somehow. But it also takes place across different scales in time and space, like most practices do, right? So when you do a book, it's out there in the world for years. When you do a show, it's up for 6 weeks. Then when you do teaching, it's got like its own time scale. So I'm just going to talk about one example of my practice that I think addresses directly a particular notion of site specificity. Because I think that has a lot to do with how to position oneself. So what is normally considered site specificity, I'd like to readjust towards what I would call existing conditions, working with existing conditions, which is really important to me. So I'm one of the founding members of an artist-run space called Eastside Projects. The physical, it's in Birmingham, in the UK. The physical fabric of the building is somehow what I really consider my work. This is an ongoing project, obviously. And Eastside Projects was founded according to 3 kind of directing policies. I'm going to show you just photographs of the first show, where we started from the empty, because obviously it's not empty, but space of the gallery, with the first thing, that thing, which is an artwork by Heather and Ivan Morrison, which is our office, and it's called Pleasure Island. And the program unraveled over 12 weeks, which were the building up of the gallery as a collective cumulative artwork. So our 3 operating policies are, the first one is an expanded program, the fact that architecture, graphic design, publishing, accounting, and exhibition making is all part of the program. So the practice is not I wouldn't call that interdisciplinary, but it integrates all disciplines as part of the program. The second thing is that an artwork and an organization can have a continuous collective evolution. So each aspect of the gallery is in process, in constant evolution, which means that the gallery and the exhibition is the manifestation of the changing relationships that are happening into it. And then the last thing, which has to do with existing conditions, is that work may remain, so that each person who comes and works in the space has to respond to the previous person's work as well, and this forms part of the existing conditions. In that way, the gallery is a collection. Very abruptly. We're now changing.
My work similarly takes place across kind of various image regimes. I wouldn't necessarily even talk about mediums, but kind of image regimes and how images work in various contexts, as well as narrative modes, how narratives are constructed and how little or much you reveal in order to construct a narrative. And one of the big questions for me for quite a long time in relation to this term of kind of how we place ourselves is, what are we allowed to talk about and what are we expected to talk about or to make work about? And I've kind of often observed in the art world how there is a sort of implicit expectation of artists having to perform some kind of authentic identity. And this is especially true in relation to artists who come from a non-Western context. But even within a Western context, the specificity of where we come from is obviously hugely important, and often we tend to work in relation to that, and that gives us a sort of right to speak about it or to make work in relation to that context and to that specificity. And I've been interested for a while in questioning that and in sort of placing myself in a position or in a place where immediately there is the question, why are you talking about this? Who are you to make work about that? So one of the first works where I did this explicitly was kind of a series of works in relation to the Benin bronzes, and it's also called the Benin Project. And the Benin bronzes were a large number of artifacts that were stolen by the British in 1897 during a kind of raid in the Benin Kingdom, which today is part of federal Nigeria. And they were brought back to London and auctioned off to recover the costs of the war and sent to museums all over the world, and they are to this day in over 500 collections all over the world. So there are obviously kind of two stakeholders or two parties involved that sort of would have an immediate relationship with this, which is the British and the Edo people in Nigeria. I do live in London, but for me it was kind of interesting to see that these objects are now all over the world, and we do encounter them in London, in Paris, in Berlin, and it's another side of globalization which has been around for a very long time with these kinds of museums, and this places us in a position of responsibility towards these objects and their journey. So for this piece, The Visitor, it's a video, I traveled to Nigeria and had an audience with the current king of Benin and a court of 40 chiefs. And the piece, as I said, is The Visitor, so it's sort of switches the gaze towards me, as much as it is about the court and this encounter. It's also about me and this cliché, the position of the white European visitor in an African court, and as that is performed for the camera. Yeah, that's by way of introduction. Oh, and then this is just as a kind of introduction to the project that is actually shown at the Kunstverein. And here at the place, quite often my work is in relation to quite specific sites of history, as with the Benin bronzes, and I'm interested in traveling to these sites. I mean, it's a sort of truism that we can't go back in time, but we can go back to a place. And the place is in the present, we encounter it in the present. So it's a relationship to history and representation that takes place in the present. And this is a story that sort of it centers around a story, or a nucleus of a story that I came across when I was already interested in going to Egypt 2 years ago. And it's about 14 international cargo ships that were stuck in the Suez Canal when the 1967 June War broke out between Israel and Egypt and the other surrounding Arab countries. And Egypt in this war, which only lasted a very short time, it's also referred to as the Six-Day War, the Egyptians closed the canal, and while they closed the canal, these cargo ships were already in the canal. And what was a sort of short war became a very long period of being stuck for the ships. They were only able to leave in 1975 after 8 years. So this was kind of the starting point, and that's pretty much all I knew, and it's quite a kind of incredible story that sort of has been forgotten largely by the kind of official historical accounts of this war. So I traveled to Egypt and initially was interested in a kind of notion of sort of hallucination of place, where you are somewhere where there's obviously nothing left of that event. To use a term that might come back later.
It's just the title of the work that we have.
And I was kind of interested in spending time there and just hallucinating initially what that event was, and yeah.
So I'm introducing the next term, which is archive. But you were supposed to start. Oh no, I started. Fine. I mean, I actually don't have so much to say about archives, I have to say. So I'm talking about the Egyptian project right now, which is a very particular project within my practice, very different to what I showed before. This, working with and in relationships to archives, what I have to offer about is this, that I decided to use found material as my primary archive. The story of the project for me starts from a very different standpoint, actually. A sentence that kept on reappearing like a refrain in conversations that I had with people who were born or grew up in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, but didn't live there anymore, so who left, who were exiled for different reasons. And mostly were in Paris or in Switzerland, actually. They kept on talking about it, saying there is nothing left, hence us giggling earlier, right? So this sentence was kind of like haunting me for quite a long time. So there is nothing left in our imagination, of course, corresponds to a total destruction of the city, but this is not actually what happened in Alexandria. The last time, or the only time that it was substantially destroyed was actually in the 19th century, so way before these people had been there. So the relationship to archives, in my case, had to do with these fragments of conversations, and I found, so in the series of like these conversations, through the conversation with a particular lady who lives in Paris called Dolly Pitiliano, actually, she told me that she had 4 reels of 60mm films in her attic. Actually in her cellar, not in her attic, even though the attic sounds better, but that she had been given them by an Italian diplomat who had given them to someone else who somehow passed them on. They ended up with her, and she of course doesn't have a 16mm projector because not so many people do in their home, especially not when they're like 75 years old. But these reels somehow became for me what I would call my primary archive or my primary source material. The reason why they were so potent for me, this is not from them actually, this is an image from them, it was the fact that I know that the last people who left Egypt in the 50s, so after Nasser's revolution of 1952, had to leave without images, meaning when they crossed the border, the thing that was confiscated from them, the last thing that was confiscated from them, were personal photographs. So this idea of an exile without images, where you have imagination but you have no images, meant that me finding these reels of footage, somehow it became like being restituted this material and these images of something that people were talking to me about. So the 4 reels were filmed between 1930 and 1935. I restored them. I looked at them. There's a lot of kind of family footage or whatever, and there is also about a minute and a half of some people that they're called fellahs in Egypt, people who work in cotton fields, picking cotton in a cotton field and putting it into bags. And I mean, as you probably know, the cotton, Egyptian cotton, is a very precious material. All of those bags were then shipped to England to be weaved in the mills of Lancashire. So I used this film, which I photographed extensively, as a particular way to deal with working with archives. So I'm kind of activating it through my own interest and my own stories through it. Like somehow, yes, this is what happened. You have to talk about archives now.
Okay. Well, I kind of have to maybe first say that I've been interested in archives for a long time, but I have always refused to use them, and to use them in my work, actually. It always felt like somehow kind of a shortcut to something, or a shortcut to the past, and I was always kind of afraid to use that shortcut. So I didn't want to use kind of archival images for a long time, but in relation to this project, I did spend 3 months in Egypt, as I said, kind of hallucinating this story, and finding out little snippets of the story from people who lived near the Suez Canal, and who supplied food to the crew members. But it was really a kind of whole sort of detective job after I came back from Egypt that led me to a lot of material, because the story itself, as I said, is not really recorded in history books, because it's one of these things that it's not relevant to the events that history is interested in, which is the war and who won it and what was occupied. And it's a very significant war in 1967 in the region, whose consequences are still with us today. So there is reams and reams written about this, but the story of these 14 cargo ships in the middle of it is not even a footnote, hasn't even made it into a footnote of any of these books. So there are no official archives. I did find very few newspaper articles at the time. This one is from a British newspaper, because obviously the crews, the ships were international ships from Britain, France, Sweden, Poland, Czech, yeah, so kind of a whole range. And at the time the newspapers did report on the story that there were these sailors trapped in the Suez Canal and how did they live and what was going on. Then it just kind of, it sort of disappeared from the radar. But I, through contacting the shipping companies, I managed to track down individual crew members, and I traveled to Germany, to Hamburg, and to various other places to visit these crew members who are now in their 70s, and who kind of started for me to piece the story together by speaking about how they lived on the ships, and also by showing and sharing with me a lot of visual material, which became quite important in the process of the work. And I did find, like Celine, I guess, boxes of Super 8 film and slides and these kind of album pages that people had made and shared with me. And the story sort of started to come together around how they lived there, how they spent Christmas, for example. Also, they started to design their own stamps, And I was kind of interested, I guess, in relation to the archive, is kind of how you not just sort of an archive isn't just sort of an accumulation, but it's almost kind of actively produced in this case. And they started to make stamps for various occasions and to send letters home. And this, to me, was quite an incredible fact, because by making stamps, you effectively declare something a territory, a sovereign territory. So this was like a chunk of the Suez Canal in between the war fronts, a kind of no man's water that was sort of declared its own territory. And it relates also to notions of creativity and how we feel time. This is another one. They also organized their sporting events. In 1968, for example, they organized the Ships Olympics, parallel to the Mexico Olympics that were happening. And
How
that's
long
sort of
did they
interesting.
live there? Sorry, how
Sorry?
many boats were stuck for 8 years?
14.
8 years.
8 years,
And,
yeah.
and did the crew members stay for as long as that?
No, the crews over time were exchanged. There was always a crew there. There were always crews there, but obviously individual members were exchanged. But there was a community was always there. And then the ship, obviously, kind of, I mean, it raises a lot of questions and fantasies. These things of kind of sports activities, questions around masculinity and the sort of cultural imagination of the ship as this kind of romantic space, but where things go on and we don't sort of know exactly.
Yeah, but also the fact that they kept all of this.
And that they kept all of this material, yeah. And it was not actually until just now in November, when I went back to Egypt to exhibit the work, that I finally had access to real archives in Egypt. And I kind of thought there's a kind of interesting relationship between revolutions and the time after revolutions, when archives start to slowly open. And even though there is kind of on the ground and in real political terms, there's obviously a lot of work to be done, but I thought it was very interesting that shortly after the revolution, there was a different relationship to allowing people access to this material and the past, and to producing kind of alternative interpretations of the past. In a police state, there was only one version of history, the official version that's taught in schools, and it's actually really difficult to even engage with history because people are very suspicious and say, why are you interested in that, and why are you sort of looking at these things? They're over and we know exactly what happened, and it's seen as quite threatening, and also a few times I was nearly arrested just for asking questions or taking photographs of the wrong thing. So I thought it was really interesting that I managed to get access to archives and found also different kinds of images from the ones that I found from the crew members. So kind of the story is told from a different vantage point.
Obsolescence, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
This is a term.
Is
So-
that the third term?
That
Yeah.
obsolescence.
What does it mean?
When things are obsolete,
Okay.
when they're old and they don't, it's a bit worse than being old. Obsolete really means that there is no use for something anymore. It stops to have a function. We thought it would be interesting to talk about the stamp in relationship to the technology and the mediums that we use, because we use film, we use slides, even worse, I use black and white slides. So it seems that this idea of using obsolete technology somehow has a meaning for us. So I wanted to just talk about that a little bit and think about it a little bit. So I go back to my 16mm reels, right, which I decided not to show as raw footage, not to show as raw material. Staying with that medium was something that I couldn't really deal with, also because of this position in relationship to an archive, the fact that I decided that was my archive, even though it wasn't. Right? I needed to open it up. So in order to open it up, one thing was to deal with its relationship with time, or the illusion of time. So on a very basic structural sense, of course, film, speed of film means that it gives you the illusion of movement in time, right? So I started photographing the film in order to open up the space between images. So that, for me, meant that I started working with slides in two senses. Of course, slides also go round and round, which means that there is also this illusion of movement in the sense that you don't press next, right? There's a timer. Kind of goes, it's sort of translated into another medium of movement. And then on the other hand, it also, the nice or the interesting thing for me in looking at the slide carousel is that exactly because it goes round and round, it undoes the sense of inevitable narrative that film can have. Film, even though it might be written or used in many different ways, does start and end somewhere quite different. You might loop it, you might do different things with it, but the slide itself, the breaking down of that movement into slides, somehow did something that allowed me to open up that narrative of what those images were of, and somehow inhabit it. So I inhabit it in different ways. One is that I took that footage of the cotton fields and decided to actually travel the journey that cotton would have made in 1925. And so once it was put into bags, where did it go? Where was it weaved? So I followed cotton production that led me all the way back to the UK, of course, into the mills of Lancashire that are now all museums, because the Industrial Revolution pretty much ended, as we know, like all that industrial production ended about 30 to 40 years ago. And then on the other side, I took another fragment of that film and used it to talk about what happens when somebody says there is nothing left. What is it that is gone, that is not there anymore? So this is something about obsolescence, but then there's something else. Obsolescence also has to do with translation, right? When something is not used anymore, or doesn't have so much meaning in the present anymore, then you translate it. So I translate 16mm to slides. Let's say that's a form of translation. Then there's slightly more absurd forms of translations that happen when you're working, especially in a country where you don't speak the language. Right? I don't speak Arabic. Actually, Uriel speaks a bit of Arabic, but I do not. So the title of my first piece was called "There Is Nothing Left," because of that sentence. It happened that, of course, I wanted to have it in Arabic in all the exhibitions that it was in. So the sister of the curator who I was working with, Bassam al-Baruni, actually did a translation for me. And there were these slides in French and in English and Arabic. Of course, I could never understand what the Arabic ones were. And then it came up, like, completely by chance when we were in the process of making this book just a couple of months ago. So we're talking about a year and a half later, that the graphic designer in Egypt told me, or just as a footnote, in one of her emails, she said, "Did you know that they translated your title in 'There is nothing to the left'?" So I've had this project for a year and a half of people just asking totally different questions, because of course there is nothing to the left. Everybody took it as like some kind of political statement about the left not being there anymore. It had nothing to do with that. Anyway, that was quite funny. So the third note on translation is the fact that the book that is here and that is we're going to be launching tomorrow actually also, it has 3 titles. It has one title in 3 languages. We decided not to translate it. So it's called Terrain Vague, which is actually French. Something in Arabic that everybody assumes is a translation of that, but is not at all. And the third title is Persistent Images. Exactly with this notion of that you can't actually translate, but you read translations